So, hello again. We will start with the last two speakers of this afternoon, João Ribas and Francisco Santos. João Ribas will start. He's telling me the title is not exactly as
it's more or less, yeah.
But he's going to speak about nature, culture, or hyper-complexity. So, have fun.
So, you can all hear me? Yes? So, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming and for staying. To Marianne for the invitation, and of course to all the other speakers. So I'm going to be talking about this relationship, this oppositional relationship that is, I think, at the core of the conference, which is this the tension between natural and artificial, not only in terms of how we relate and react to this distinction, but also, which seem to be, at least at first, somewhat antagonistic, but also where it leaves us in dealing with a basic issue, which is what I would describe as a state of hypercomplexity. And I think that what interests me about the distinction between natural and artificial isn't necessarily the techniques, but the constitutive effects that result from the relationship between the two of them. So that the phenomena that arises from us being situated between the natural world that constitutes us, from which we arise, and the technologies and representations that we create to then mediate that existence. So we arise from a natural world and create an artificial one. How that is constructed, and what seems to be the case that artificial intelligence is beginning to elicit in us a set of responses that are somewhat between fear and awe. Fear in the sense, or let's say awe in the sense of the capacities and capabilities of artificial intelligence, and eventually the possible emergence of that intelligence into consciousness, which I think is awe-inducing, and simultaneously the potential to reproduce and to a certain extent surpass humanity itself in the most pessimistic sense. So I think that brings in the fear element. And of course these two emotions, in terms of human experience, are very close together. We are in awe of the divine, for example, and we fear it as well. And the increasing sophistication that AI, and its increasing pervasiveness has caused us, I think, consistently take a step back to rethink and reaffirm and redefine what the human is, or what human capabilities are, as a result of this fear and this awe. And by confronting us precisely with the limits of what we might consider to be the definitions or capacities of what human intelligence can do, and sets up a set of divergent, I would say, identifications, where perhaps intuition and computation exist on opposing sides. And part of this effect seems to be defining and asserting what AI still cannot do, right? Always that artificial intelligence makes us recursively step back and think about what defines, what do we want to assert as what is human. Be it our sense of lived or embodied experience, or the capacity of human beings either to discover insights regarding the most complex questions, say the origin of life 4.4 billion years ago, but also I would say metaphysical or speculative insights, such as the sense of who we are, the profound sense of meaning that is intrinsic to human experience, if not the question of meaning in general, right? To be concerned with meaning in terms of our ability to give meaning to experience of phenomena in the world, seemingly beyond thinking of ourselves as constantly processing streams of data. For instance, one of the extraordinary capacities of the human species seems to be to craft fictions, to come up with something that did not exist before, to give it shape, to materialize it, and also to conceive of things that do not exist and to create them, right? To think of a unicorn and then give it a shape and give it a form and to materialize it. This is what AI makes us want to affirm, that through some form of recursion that sets into relief how we are different, that we are different, and that we aren't simply logical, calculating entities. Yet, at the same time, it confronts us with something which is the startling ability to do things that humans seem to be very good at doing for a very long time. So part of our evolutionary development is to be, for example, very good at pattern seeking. So we've evolved to be a kind of pattern-seeking focused intelligence through millions of years of experience that's encoded in the sensory and motor portions of the brain. So we have a heritage of millions of years of this evolutionary process. So that if we stared out as ancestral humans, we stared out at the dense canopy of branches, we would have seen a variety of overlapping shapes, different geometries, contours and assemblages of leaves and bushes that would sway in the wind and for a brief moment of time would form combinations. And the brain, in fact, adapted to retrieve information from this environment in this way through the development of what is, in fact, a metabolically very expensive brain. It consumes about 25% of energy for about 2/3 of body mass, which is not a very good ratio in terms of trade-off. And it led to all kinds of cultural adaptations. For example, cooking, right, which increases the metabolic potential. There's less energy expended in chewing food, for example, the stomach, which is an integral part of this process, actually. In fact, it leads to the increased size of the brain. Or, for example, alphabetic systems, and there is a correlation between visual signs. The visual signs in human alphabets are disproportionately related to the shapes that are found in nature. Right? So the shapes of letters are somehow related to the shapes that we've learned to identify in the tundra. This gets very, very weird when you think about something like blinking. Human beings blink for a large portion of time, and it's actually very bad as an evolutionary adaptation because you're closing your eyes, therefore making yourself more vulnerable. But in fact, we see patterns everywhere. So we see a face in an electrical outlet, sort of impossible not to see a face there. And we often make very stupid deductions as a result. So we do this to a fault. That's why we have paranoia, for example. And we see coincidences, things that supposedly have meaning and patterns and in fact do not. But of course, AI is much better at doing this than we are. It's particularly good at operating in domains of knowledge that are formalizable, so things like data mining and pattern recognition and all kinds of data processing. And so it's not only very good at doing this, it's very good at doing this mimicking how we do it, which is particularly troublesome if you want to preserve something of the human. And it surpasses it in capacity, in speed, in scalability, and in following the rules. Right? It doesn't get distracted, for one. So if you take the example, and it's sort of, right, this is, the link is this. If you take the example of, say, deep learning, which is, in fact, the Turing Prize this year was awarded to the pioneers of deep learning. There's a long evolutionary history here of different kinds of AI, all kinds of possibilities, linear systems, etc. It's more or less interesting depending on what your gradient, how granular you want to get into the conversation. But this is the idea that you use artificial neural networks that mimic a system of human neurons. So the process is something like you feed an AI definitions of something. So dog, not dog. Right? And then it processes this through a set of, it builds a predictive model that becomes more and more complex through these layers. So a dog, it'll look at the image of the dog, it'll break it into pixelized systems, and it'll say, okay, a tail signifies dogness. It'll proceed through this scale and learn to become more and more adaptable to discovering, in fact, recognizing what a dog is. And this is actually one of the rules of AI, which is that everything that's easy is hard and everything that's hard is easy. So what does this mean? Doing very complex calculations very quickly, faster than any human brain, is very easy. Doing what a 3-year-old does, which is, that's a dog, is actually much more complex. There's a name for this. If you're interested, it's called the Moravec principle. It's more or less the idea that sensory motor skills require immense computational resources. Right? Whereas calculation is fairly straightforward. This high-level reasoning is not very difficult. It's a question of space and computational speed. And so this neural network, which is the way that there seems to be the tendency, at first it was Bayesian networks, and then there was a brief period where there was a sort of vector machine. There's a whole kind of genealogy here, which is interesting. But it, again, reverts us consistently back to what AI cannot do. What are we good? If we evolve to recognize patterns and the computer is so much better than we are, what are we good at? Well, we're really good at being pre-conscious. That's something, in fact, most of what we do is pre-conscious. So 99.68% of our decisions are completely pre-conscious. You only have to think about, and in fact, not only this, they're made pre-conscious and then reach consciousness, and then, of course, most of our decisions never reach consciousness. Right. We do things constantly during the day. So, we think we make 111 decisions we're actually making 35,000 on average per day, right? So we're not even aware of half the stuff we're doing. And in fact, we have two brains. If we think about the preconscious aspect of human experience, we have the brain that we associate with the mass in our heads, but we also have the enteric nervous system, which is, you can describe it as the brain that lives in your gut. And it has 500 million nerve cells, more or less 100 million neurons, and there's 20 different neuron types. This means that you have a brain the size of a cat brain in your stomach. It's more or less the same scale. What this is doing, this consistent, AI is very good at computation, we are very good at being preconscious. It sets up this dynamic of these thresholds, right? These slashes in between things that we exist in. And so, for example, the slash between the bit and the atom, right? The two constitutive elements of this description, natural, artificial, the atom as the base of organic matter and the bit as the base of digital matter. And these, in fact, are coming closer and closer and closer and closer together. One of the examples of that proximity is the problem of storage. So you're talking about AI, you're talking about data sets. You feed data sets into artificial intelligence. It learns and becomes more sophisticated. We are constantly producing data. We are data vectors, right? We emit data regularly, almost every millisecond. And so this is actually one of the longest-standing concerns of human civilizations, right? The alphabet stores memory is a form of memory storage. Writing is a form of storage. So we just adapt and migrate formats throughout. This idea of technologies for managing and storing information, we have the problem with the vastness of digital data. So the numbers are so immense that there's a practical problem. So we roughly are set to exhaust the supply of microchip-grade silicon by 2040. So that's a clear marker in which we'll have to come up with another storage solution for this problem. We actually have a very good one, because we ourselves are containers of data, right? We are made of the most efficient, most expansive data storage system ever conceived, which is DNA. It's remarkably good as a storage system because it not only stores, and it doesn't necessarily only store usable data or for example, the adaptation for the human uterus is part of the genome which was silent or dormant for a very long time and then wakes up and allows human civilization to flourish. So it stores things that are useless, like my emails to my mother sitting next to the Declaration of Human Rights, for example. And so what happens is, what if you cross these two conditions? What if you cross DNA, right, as the genome, and the digital data set, right? What if you intertwine these two conditions? What you have is the storage density of DNA is so immense that, in fact, in a piece of DNA the size of a sugar cube, you can store just about every single video that's ever been made. And if you keep it in the right conditions, it'll roughly last about 10,000 years. Right? So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good system. It means that you could do things like you can encode an image into E. coli and then retrieve it back with minimum damage. So you see the gradient's not very different. It also means that you could pass on the complete works of Shakespeare to your children as well as your brown hair. And in fact, it gets so immense. So this is the living organism that has the biggest genome that we've ever found, the largest genome, which is the Paris japonica. It's amazing that it's got so much more DNA than we do. Right? So there isn't a relationship between the sophistication of the organism and the size of its genome. So an onion has like 50 times more DNA than we do. Right? You can almost cry thinking about it. And if you stretched it out, it would be the japonica would be about 300 feet, about 90 meters long, which is extraordinary. It's immense. It's got 150 billion base pairs. You can pretty much everything that any human's ever done could be stored. So what do we do? How do we do this? How do we deal with these thresholds? We're in these slashes. Well, one of the things that human beings do, they're very good at doing, is metaphorizing. Right? We deal with this stuff by coming up with a story, coming up with some way of processing, metaphorizing this. And in fact, we do this all the time. So in the period that AI is become an issue, or has emerged into sort of the cultural conversation, we have lived under these two metaphors, right? So we have naturalized this condition to say, at first we lived under the metaphor of the mushroom cloud, right, which stood in for a kind of post-war system of nuclear destruction, and now to one scientific moment, and now we live under this cloud. Right? So what's up with the clouds? Why is this this recurring thing? Why did this metaphor, this diaphanous representation of post-war paranoia, become the metaphor, the positive metaphor of network-driven conditions? The saturation, we live in this space, we play in this space, we live in this place, we work in this place. Now, it's interesting because they're interrelated, and they'll take us to where I want to end up. So, this image, which I think is familiar to everybody, comes from, initially it comes from the first moment the image emerges, July 16th, 1945, which is with the first Trinity test. What happens in this explosion is that it's captured on film, which is also already notable, but the scale of the image is particularly interesting. Because it's a fraction of a second of a shape that's constantly changing with the discharge of energy never seen in the history of humanity. Right? So it's fixed in a frozen moment, and in fact what this moment is the potential eradication of all human traces on the planet. Right? So you have a fraction of a second of an image that actually represents the total annihilation of humanity. Right? Seen from this impossible scale. It's unrepresentable. It's you can only fix it for a fraction of a second, and it's constantly changing and morphing. This creates a problem, which is if this potentially is the eradication of all human civilization, we pretty much want to make sure it doesn't happen. Right? So one way you make sure it doesn't happen is if this guy has 5, you have 5. If he fires one, you have to make sure that you can fire one. The best case scenario is you mutually destroy each other. This is the basic game that's played, right? So if I can mutually destroy you, I disincentivize you from destroying me. Clear? Okay. So you have a problem, which is if I fire the nuclear warhead, the radiation from the attack will knock out every communication system available in 1945. Radio doesn't work, telephone doesn't work, because the radiation will eradicate the system. So you need a system for communicating, for assuring that you can counterattack. So the best option was this report by the RAND Corporation written by Paul Barron, which is you create a distributed network. There is no central point. Every piece of the network is connected to every other piece, and so if you strike at one point, the system will rearrange and reconnect itself. Right? Sounds familiar, right? So starting in 1969, the first packets of information moved through this kind of system, right, which we now know is the internet. Started as a series of 4 nodes. So on the 29th of October, it's the first packet of data. And the protocols are exactly the same. TCP/IP, pretty much the packet switching system is basically the same. And then what had happened is the nodes just proliferated. What's interesting is, of course, one of the first things that people decide to do before it evolved into this vast global network is you want to give it a problem, right? So what would be a really good problem to give to this computer, to the ENIAC? Well, predicting weather seemed to be a pretty good one. So there had been many, many models, attempts to model what predicting the weather would be like. And one guy, Fry Richardson, pretty much estimated you would need 64,000 people calculating nonstop to figure out if it was going to rain tomorrow. And in fact, the ENIAC did predict the first single-day weather prediction in 1950. Again, clouds. Right? The first problem that's given to a computer is to figure out. And it gets weirder. So the first Photoshop image in 1987, made by Jean-Claude, there's a cloud. Not only is there a cloud, but it seems to be a reproduction of the 19th century sublime, right? So it's like Caspar David Friedrich and his wife. They say he always said it's his wife. I have some doubts as to whether Jean-Claude was married to this. I mean, it sounds it's a little bit heteronormative, but the idea that there's an imaginary here that is consistently reproduced, and there's also monstrosities that result, right? So the threat of nuclear war is not only the impact of the explosion, but it's the the pervasive, invisible effect of radiation, right? Which would go on to damage, it causes cancer, for example. And this menacing power is really, really important. It's beyond representation. It has no sight, it has no smell, it has no sound. It exists outside of the human perceptive system. Right? You cannot detect radiation. It simply works on you, right? And it works on your DNA. It works on your genome, and it gives rise to Godzilla and Spider-Man. Spider-Man is bitten by a radioactive spider. So I want to maintain that we're exactly in the same situation. So information functions like this invisible mass that covers us in this cloud. So we feel it through a series of what I would call IRL effects. Okay? So I'm going to give you some of those effects and then talk about how AI has a place here. So one of them is a basic change in one of the fundamental principles of human existence or human knowledge, which is searching versus sorting. So we used to sort, now we search. So this is what search would look like in real life. There's no need to separate the garfs and the garfs. No, nothing else needs to be said. But we also consistently reenact this metaphor. So we have this box in which we throw a question, and the return is a piece of information. It's exactly the same as the Oracle of Delphi, right? The woman is the mediating algorithm. The search box is there, and the user just says, if you like Aristotle, you also like Democritus. You also have the shift between image and object. So the history of Western representation was how to take three-dimensional reality and put it onto a two-dimensional surface, right? Perspective. How do I take this object, model it into two-dimensional space? We're now in the complete inversion of that, which is we have three-dimensional vectors that we want to make into two-dimensional objects, right? Digital rapid prototyping. So it's a total inversion of how we see optics and how we see representation. What this creates is this condition of hypercomplexity, which is how does the human intelligence, how does the human apparatus relate and adapt to these conditions? One of them is you can always opt out. You can try to compete by metabolizing faster energy drinks, ADHD medication, varying circadian sleep cycles, etc. Or you can try to understand how hypercomplexity works. One of those ways is that we live in a world that's defined by systems and events that are too complicated for anyone to understand. Okay, we trust them, but we don't really know how they work. And the spaces are multiple, the feelings and perceptions, filters and data are very complex, and certainty there appears very simple. You want to grab onto this. Something that's you have a hyper-complex problem, you go for the simplest solution, right? You have the problem of overpopulation, let's just get rid of the immigrants. It's just the more hyper-complex, the more the human response is simplicity. So we have to begin to understand that these solutions, the natural intelligence solutions, are not very useful. Okay? Here's an example. Goal versus outcome. AI is very good at dealing with outcomes, and we are very good at dealing with goals. So we say we want something to happen, and we give the AI the algorithm to do so, and the AI will do what it thinks. It'll do the outcome that's desired. It won't do what we want it to do. So it does what we told it to do, but it doesn't do what we wanted it to do. Right? So an example is if you put an AI playing Tetris, it will pause the game because then it will never lose. Right? It's not what we told it to do. Or if there's a simulation, there was a modeling simulation based on an artificial life system that had to reproduce itself. The goal of it is to survive, reproduce itself and survive. It had a limited environment. I'm almost done. Had a limited environment, and it had to draw resources from that environment and reproduce. The energy charge of reproduction was lower than the energy charge of survival. This is basic. So for human civilization to exist, to go out and hunt and find an animal and then bring it back and cook it and eat it is less of an energetic charge than to reproduce itself. Right? So the AI modeled this, and what it decided to do is it divided all the newborn AI, right, all the newborn elements, into two categories. One is the ones that you eat, and the other ones are the ones that you use to reproduce to make more to eat. right? That's not really what we wanted to do. So if it sounds perverse, but it gets very complicated, because if you give it a practical application like reducing CO2 emissions, it's not going to take a very long time for it to realize what the biggest problem in CO2 emissions is, right? And I think it's in this room, just to give you a hint. It gets even weirder when you get into things like truth or fact, the intuitive sense that something is right, which I think is generational. I think that pretty soon people won't know what that feeling is like, which is interesting. It's the affective apparatus will also adapt. But so could truth or fact be about having a big enough data set that you can reconstitute its parameter? Right? Could that be an adaptation? So let's give it. So the truth or falsity of a situation would basically be only about the complexity of the data set. So give an example. How many of you have smartphones? Okay, almost everyone. How many of you read the manual for your smartphone? So that's an adaptation, right? You know this. You know how to do this. You never learned how to do this, right? That is an adaptation that you didn't even realize you were doing. It's not an accident, okay? And there's another one, and I'll leave you with this scenario. Imagine that we've been in this room for about 4 hours. Someone must be frustrated or annoyed. Probably now more than ever before. Imagine that everyone in this room, all of a sudden, and this isn't going to happen, but imagine that someone in this room kills someone else in this room. We're all here, we're all witnesses to that crime. So we can take a cross-section of the data admitted by your cell phone and prove without shadow of a doubt that you were in this room when the crime happened. We will then cross that with another data set, which is that some of you may have stolen something or have a history of violent offense or freaked out one time and drove a car into a tree. So we'll cross that with that data set. Then we'll cross a data set with somebody was in jail before or sent a text message saying, I can really kill him. Or wrote in an email, God, I'm just so fed up. One of these days I'm just going to lose it. And if you cross all those data sets, you will have a version of what happened in this room that is true, but isn't what we, by our criteria, would define it as truth, right? We don't feel comfortable with that kind of truth. We don't feel comfortable that someone's probation, so that someone can leave jail based on the fact that they may or may not repeat the offense based on statistical data about behavior, right? We're not comfortable. I hope we're not comfortable with that idea. At the same time, we have to understand that this threshold is coming closer together, and that perhaps what I think is this kind of infancy that we're existing in, which is that we just want things to go back to normal. We want them to be simple. There were only two genders, and it was very simple, and we were very good at doing X, Y, and Z. That we have to overcome that and understand that the most human thing of all is part of the problem, which is our desire for certainty and simplicity. And so we have to think hyper-complexly about hyper-complex problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguens, for a very stimulating talk. Now, AI, Francisco Santos, an evolutionary approach to human cooperation.
Yes, good. So thank you. Let me switch on the microphone. So thank you especially to William again for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here in Porto. So I will slightly change gears and speak about one particular topic, which is cooperation. So that's the only topic that I will speak. So why do we have so much cooperation in nature? Why do we have cooperation among humans? Why do we see that? Why we normally say that humans are kind of champions of cooperation? What are the mechanisms underlying such level of cooperation? I will start from AI, but also from from evolutionary biology. But given that the festival is also about AI, it's interesting to see where these type of topics can fit in. So normally when you think about artificial intelligence, you have 4 classical perspectives. So you can imagine that you can develop algorithms or computational representations to allow us to organize knowledge, to represent knowledge, and then use these to create very optimized algorithms to help us to act rationally, to exploit something, to optimize a certain decision. João has just spoke about several important machine learning advances that allow us to do this. And then we have the other side of artificial intelligence, which was the mainstream a few years ago. Now it's getting slightly down to the downside, which is how can I use this type of techniques to understand how humans think and to create machines that may act as humans. So I'll go into the right side of life and I'll get into this side. But when you think about artificial intelligence and these smart agents, and you think about cooperation, you immediately see that these levels of intelligence cannot explain everything. You need, when you see that you have cooperation at all levels of complexity, you need some kind of a population representation here. And the goal here is not only to understand how little agents, little individuals think about cooperation, but also how to explain such emergence. And then we get into the realm of what is normally called complex systems, which tries to connect how microscopic interactions lead to very complex emergent behaviors, which in this case is cooperation. How can little individuals that react in some way lead to the complex patterns that we observe? And what is the tiny atom of cooperation? You can define cooperation in different ways. Normally you think about game theory to devise, to identify the dilemmas underlying cooperation. So the easiest way to define cooperation is, let's imagine that you have a donor that is ready to pay a cost to offer a benefit to a receiver. So if you have these circumstances, by the way, if they both play as a donor and the receiver, you get the famous prisoner's dilemma. But that's totally unimportant here. So what is the role, what is the question here? So why should we cooperate in these circumstances? It would be much better to receive the benefits without paying any cost. So that's the kind of rational point of view. We can also think about this problem from an evolutionary point of view. That's what Darwin did. And he said, okay, so if you have this competition, how can evolution and natural selection can lead us to cooperation? He was thinking about social insects, very simple organisms, but of course you can think about the same thing when you think about humans. Again, we have the same problems at all levels of complexity. You can think about tax paying, you can think about collective action to raise our family, you can think about these magic collective endeavors where you think about people ready to arrive at home and spend their time writing a Wikipedia page. Why do people do this? Why do you devise these Linux and open source projects which everyone benefits? What leads people to do this? But nowadays we have new types of dilemmas as well arising from artificial intelligence as well. So we are not any longer living in a population, let's say, of humans. We are living in hybrid populations where you have populations made of humans and artificial entities. And if you have this kind of settings, now the question that emerges is not only what is the self-organization of humans, but how can you, for instance, what is the impact of artificial agents in the human behavior? So for instance, if you, a few months ago, it was shown that if you have a system where humans delegate an action of cooperate or not to a machine, they will cooperate more. Why? Because the code will be available. There is something there. So if humans are coding the action, they are delegating their choice, people will cooperate more. Or for instance, if you have a population of humans and you put a robot there, a machine, that always defects, even if the humans naturally would cooperate, this will nudge the entire population of humans to defect as well. So we have to devise algorithms that allow us to understand humans, but also to be careful not to lead the system to the wrong side. If you think about the AI race and you think that our students in computer science can easily write a code that, for instance, pick Twitter and download tons of data, and from this data they can predict, for instance, if someone is likely to be depressed in 1 month. So this is fantastic. So it's something that can allow us to prevent this kind of problems. But do we really want these type of algorithms and data delivered to our insurance companies, for instance? So every time we design an algorithm, there is an ethical problem here. So it's important to be aware of this. And when we think about the AI race, we have something that in biology is called the rat-pig effect. So we have to be always running to be at the same place. So we have a kind of ecology here. So and this ecology leads us to think about these problems not in the classical point of view of game theory, where you have a few agents and super smart individuals, but instead we can take the opposite side and we think about these problems in large populations. We cannot explain these with 2 or 3 individuals. We need to have populations. And biologists, since the 80s, know very well how to do this. This is called evolutionary game theory. So the idea here is not that individuals are super smart. They simply say that the game payoffs, the return, the costs and benefits are associated with fitness. Individuals with higher fitness will produce more. But how can I move this to social settings? The nice thing is that if you associate payoff with fitness, you can use this type of tools to study genetic evolution. But formally, this is equivalent to what is called social learning, which means that individuals with a higher fitness will be imitated more often, and their behavior spread in the population, just like a disease, if you wish. Okay? I don't use olive oil because I have the gene of the olive oil. I imitated my mom, of course. So we are influenced by everyone. So social learning is part of our day life, and this creates an ecology which formally is equivalent to genetic evolution, which is very convenient. Also, we can also show that this type of social learning is equivalent to simple forms of what is normally called reinforcement learning. The idea that I learn from my past actions. And this is really neat because you can use the same set of tools to address completely different problems at different scales. The bad part of the story is that irrespectively of what you do, if, for instance, you start with a population of blue guys that are the good guys, the cooperators, and the red guys are the defectors, this individual will exploit all the others, will become a role model, everyone will imitate him, and at the end, everyone will be a defector. So this is called the tragedy of the commons. So you always end up there. So how can I escape this? So that's the research question here. What are the mechanisms that life has devised to escape this tragedy of the commons? And there are several mechanisms. In the last decades, several mechanisms have been identified. So for instance, you can think about skin selection, you can think about the fact that in many circumstances in the past, people interact in tribes, and then you have competition at different levels and so forth. But for instance, when you think about humans, you normally think about reciprocity, which is a very convenient framework to analyze cooperation. So the easiest way to think about this is called direct reciprocity. It's the fact that I cooperate with someone because it is probable that I will interact with that person in the future. So I can reciprocate actions. So the famous tit for tat is a famous strategy for this. But the mechanism that I would like to speak to you is something that is likely my favorite mechanism. It's called indirect reciprocity. It's a mechanism that you have in eBay when you buy something. So when you buy something to someone, you don't really know what this person did in the past. You have an indication of this through their reputations. So let's imagine that we have two individuals. This one decided to cooperate or not with this one, and then I have a third party that is observing this action, and depending on this action, it will assign a new reputation to the first one. So this is kind of a mechanism based on social control. is scary. Okay? But social control is really part of our lives. I will show you a very simple experiment done in a student dormitory. So the idea is that, imagine that you have a coffee room, where every time you go and take a coffee or a glass of milk, you pay whatever you consume. Now let's imagine that no one is watching you. What is the rational choice here? Is to take the milk, not put the coin there. Okay, what these people did is they essentially put a photograph with eyes, flowers, eyes, flowers, eyes, flowers. And on the weeks where you have eyes, of course everyone knew that this was just photos. People would cooperate more. There is something imprinted in us that makes us react to the eyes, even if they know. So when I did my PhD, we had photos from our dictators at home. So the kitchen was always clean. So this mechanism is really cool because you have this mechanism that only exists among humans. It depends on the existence of language, otherwise you cannot have it, because this observer has to gossip what he observes and propagate the new reputations of these individuals. That's the reason why we never found this in any other primate besides humans. And if you have this, cooperation has been shown to emerge experimentally. So this really works. But what is the problem? What is the main core of this? Is the assessment of actions. So let's say I cooperate with someone. Should I receive a good reputation? Yeah, it's nice. I cooperated with someone. But let's say that I decide to cooperate with someone who has a bad reputation. Should I receive a good reputation or a bad reputation? So we are dealing into a definition, what is a good and a bad action. And you can have multiple rules that assign reputation that are used by the observer. So let's think about a very simple model. So here, every time you do models, you try to be as simple as possible. So a spherical cow model. So the simplest model for a norm is to consider the action and basically say that, for instance, if someone cooperates, this individual will be good. If it defects, this individual will be bad. It's a very clean social norm. What is the problem? It doesn't work. So the point is that if I cooperate with someone, I will get a good reputation. But let's imagine that I fail. I try to cooperate, I fail, I defect. Everyone will look at me, they will assign me a bad reputation, and the next day no one will cooperate with me because I had a bad reputation, and everyone becomes bad and everyone defects. So we need more complex norms. And we can, for instance, consider action, but also the possibility of having justified defection. So I consider the action, but also the reputation of the receiver. Then you go to second order norms. That's what normally calls. But you can continue. You can go to third order norms, that you consider the reputation of the receiver, but also my reputation. And you can also consider the past reputations of the receiver, to include the role of the past. So if you do this, every time you add a new layer, you add an additional set of bits. And if you go to this setting, you have a huge amount of 65,000 possible norms. And the question arises, what is the best norm? So how can I address this? Who should be considered good for cooperation to emerge? And how simple a norm needs to be to ensure cooperation in a society. So let's think about a very simple model. I have a social norm that is fixed in the population. Different norms lead the system to different reputations. The reputations are then used as a part of the decision process. And from this decision process, you have more or less cooperation. And you test all the 65,000 norms and connect the social norm to the level of cooperation. So that's what we did. And out of these 65,000 norms, only a small little set of norms are able to promote cooperation. You said? Thank you. I will be fast. And among these norms, we have different social concepts. I will show you, this is a truth table, it's really ugly, but let me translate this into English. So basically the idea is that these two norms are equally efficient in promoting cooperation. This one, I cannot use it. This one, I can use it. This one is so complex that it's almost impossible to understand. It's a kind of set of logical steps that are really, really annoying to understand. So how can I assess the complexity of these two? I can use a rule that people have shown in psychology that tells us that people have the tendency to learn easily concepts that have a very small logical expression. When the logical expression becomes larger, then people cannot understand. So if I pick this one, I can translate this and this one as a logical expression. I count the number of literals, and I get a measure of complexity. And if you do this, you can compute for each complexity the best possible norm and realize that above a certain complexity, you don't get anything more from a social norm. So it seems that there is a point above which you don't need very complex heuristics. Cooperation simply emerge. And then if you see what is so special about this norm, that is the simplest norm that can foster cooperation. Okay, this norm that we call stern judging basically tells you that you should help the good and refuse help to the bad. And if you don't do this, you will be punished with a bad reputation. It's a really ugly norm. But that's the result, okay? But if you look at this, help the good and refuse help to the bad, it's really, really scary norm. We are not so satisfied with it. But if you look at this is in the fingerprint of what people have shown to help to exist in cooperation problems among toddlers. So people do this experiment that are beautiful. If you check the videos, they are great. So imagine that you have a play with puppets, and you have a puppet passing the ball to the other puppet, and then the toddler is asked to pick the puppet that they would like to take home. And toddlers pick normally the puppet that helped the other, and the puppet that refused to help the puppet that refused to help other. And this is exactly the norm that we observe. Of course, I'm not saying that this is innate, okay? This is another question. But apparently, this very simple norm is with us from from the beginning. Okay, so we have this very simple norm that allows us to provide some kind of very simple meaning of assessing what is a good and a bad action, to understand the issue of managing of reputations and so forth. I didn't tell you about the evolution of these social norms, but we can also show that, for instance, if you have a system of tribes fighting each other, and you have tribes that use a certain norm, another tribe that use another norm, and the tribe that wins will impose a norm to the second one. If you do this, stern judging, this norm also emerge and evolve in the population. We have several problems with this issue. So for instance, the main problem is bookkeeping. So how can I bookkeep the reputations of everyone that I know? Okay, I can even consider that I can do this in small villages, but let's think about our cities. Okay, we cannot bookkeep this. Either you have eBay to bookkeep our old reputations, but the advantage is that we don't know everyone. We just interact on a network, and these networks. These social networks have very particular features. So you have individuals with tons of connections. This topology is the one that João mentioned. It's called scale-free networks. And these networks are responsible for having everyone in the world watching the same video with a kitty doing something with the wall. Because the speed of propagation of information in these networks is almost infinite. Okay? And that's where we live. Actually, the same as internet, email, Facebook, Twitter, everything has this shape. And if you have this shape, what is the impact of cooperation? Apparently, these networks are the ones that maximize cooperation. So it seems that someone is hardwiring us to have a network that maximizes cooperation. It is really, really nice. Okay, just to finish, it's also important to realize that if we are managing to understand how cooperation emerges in nature and in societies, it's also important to use exactly the same tools to foster cooperation where this cooperation does not exist. And that's what we are trying to do. We are dealing with several problems. The first one, or the most important one, is of course climate change. So climate change represents a problem that we have never faced in our evolutionary history. So what we have here? So we have a problem which is normally referred as a public good problem, where everyone is playing and no one can simply say, I don't play. And the planet is all playing the same game. And we know from theory that if you have a game of this dimension, it's almost impossible to foster cooperation. So it's really a problem that we have never faced. The second point is that we are dealing with a game that we are not cooperating with today. We are cooperating with the future generations. So we have to define new mechanisms that are, of course, new. We don't have it now, to foster cooperation in this type of dilemma for obvious reasons. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for such a morally challenging talk. We start with questions from one of you to the other.
Boss. So I have a question, actually. The question is very simple, but the explanation is going to be torturous. So you mentioned the link between reputation, the topology, and the scalability issue. So evolutionarily speaking, gossip is very interesting. So you said there's no other primate that has this kind of reputational thing. And in fact, there's a threshold for organizational complexity in some primates. So chimpanzees cap out about 25. So chimpanzees can be aware of what the limit is of being aware of what 25 other chimpanzees are doing. So they can pretty much keep track of that. Anything above that gets very complicated, and they don't quite understand how to deal with what Bobo and Coco is doing. And one of the arguments is that gossip actually functions in this way, because then it's a way of instantiating something about something who's missing, and it actually is scalable, right? Because I can talk about you can talk. And so it is a form of social cohesion, and therefore is the reputational element maybe evolutionary advantageous. So it's interesting that we've come up with a mechanism to deal with the limitations of part of the problem of our genus, right? Of another primate, we can do this because we've developed this linguistic mechanism for doing it. So my question is this a problem of scalability to be able to do this in that topological model, and whether, for example, the blockchain isn't a solution to that problem by creating layers of reputational gossip, as it were, which is much more scalable than the sort of human, right? If chimpanzees can do it to 25, we can do it with 5 billion, because we can use something like the blockchain to do so.
So I completely agree. So there is a complexity limit. So for instance, a primatologist, very famous primatologist, Robin Dunbar, he has done a very simple experiment. He basically fit the size of the part of your brain that is responsible for managing social relationships with the typical size of the group of that species. And he basically found out a very clear relationship. So if your brain, the size of your neocortex, is large, then the group size, typical group size of the primates, it becomes larger and larger. And so there is a clear connection between our capacity to manage social ties with also the capacity to keep cooperation within this limit. Then we reached to a point that Robin Dunbar didn't stop here. He did the following experiment. He said, humans are primates as well. Let's put humans there. Where does it fit? And he reached to a typical group size for humans of 150. of course, there is something.
there's a problem because we don't have civilizations that are 150 people.
So it is. I mean, you could find these 150 in some places, but of course we have something here. So the first thing that we can think about this is if you look at our mobile phones. I'm not sure if I have 150 entries on my mobile phone. So maybe the 150 is not the group size, but it's the people that you know. And the second point is that we managed to create tools, technologies that allow us to surpass this. And then we can get to the scary side. So let's think about the social score that people are implementing in China. So that's the magic way of doing this. So I have a huge population. I want to control everyone. I just assign a kind of score to people that walk more or walk less, that pay their taxes, and use this score to decide who travels abroad and who doesn't. And this is the wrong side of indirect reciprocity. So it's so strong, and that we can be tempted to control people with this, and this is, of course, scary. Please.
So peer pressure, I mean, you were talking about gossiping. It's not only words, it's not only a script, it's a set of a lot of attitude and body behavior. So I don't really understand how you can normalize, because it can be good at some moment.
Yeah.
Even it's very internalized. Maybe it's the opposite of China. It's like peer pressure. There is not an external authority, but it's actually, you understand that the way it works in this company, you have to be very versatile. Everyone is supposed to be happy, go to the gym. Also, he could go to the same school, and everyone should do the same. And if your kid is doing something wrong, he feels super ashamed. So first, my question is how you can, since it's not only a script but also attitude, how you can really modelize it, and even if the mechanical power are not externals, it can be also producing a lot of anxiety.
Yes. Of course, one needs to be careful with these spherical calm models. So we are only modeling this very simple relationship involving a cost and the benefits. Life is much more complicated. We have dilemmas that are much complex. If you have a coordination problem, things could be different. You speak, you pledge stuff, you signal. So the complexity is much larger. But I agree. Please.
I would like just to connect. Let's talk about the local work, because there is a lot of reputation in it, a lot of curation. And when we talk about art, we started to decide what is art and what is not. And then today we have institutional theories that art is what the world art says it is. So if you would, I would make the question for both. If João could imagine modeling the way an artist comes to become art, and the fight between different curators and the fight between different institutions to what is art and what is not art. If you think we could model the world of art and the fight inside the world of art and reputation, like Francisco is doing, and on your side, if you think it would make sense to try not just because this is a great issue. And the second question for me is coalition. So the fact that I can shift the system and getting a lot of people saying good about me and then the reputation goes up because they are in coalition and they are, in fact, it's not one guy parasite, but there are a lot of them supporting each other, and so there are big issues with coalition, and if that could happen in the world, and if that could, because in a coalition people are saying this is not art, what we are doing is art, but then they have access to some institutions and magazines, and suddenly it becomes art. If these questions could make you talk about modeling and the world of art. Thank you.
I don't know, without dwelling on it for much longer, I'm not sure why we would want to do that. What the value would be. I mean, it would be so. I mean, it's been done. It's Pierre Bourdieu's book on a distinction is effectively that modeling. Hauser. I mean, there's versions of this. I'm not sure that the categorical distinction between, like, is it an ontological problem? Is it a representational problem? Is it? I'm just not sure what's at stake. Like modeling the intricate personal networks that define or shape whether something succeeds or not as an artistic phenomenon. Classic examples. There's a book called Unconcealed, written by Sophie Richard. Was her doctoral thesis just before she died. She unfortunately died in childbirth. Never finished it, but it's a map about how 4 galleries and 3 museums made conceptual art in the 1960s. As an example. Hauser's one, Bourdieu's book. I mean, this has been done. Whether the modeling, I mean, it seems to be it would seem to be a poor use of sophistication. To me, I'm not interested in the problem. I think the more interesting problem is, well, I'll let you answer and then not monopolize time. No, I think the more interesting problem is, to what will this symbolic kind of thing regress to eventually as a result of that complexity? So it would be very weird I think it would be very weird, you have a better sense of this, I think it would be extremely weird to a moderately conscious system, complex intelligence system, why someone would look at basically what are shadows on the wall. Right? So a painting is a contour, a two-dimensional contour object made up of intersecting lines or shapes made of colors. Why should we find that deeply rewarding as a phenomenological experience? I think it'd be really strange to a drone to be like, why do we keep going back to this flat representational space? And find why is a combination of 4 words, specific words, very pleasing, and another combination of 4 words is not pleasing, right? These distinctions are interesting to me, not necessarily what is the combination, who this and this one.
Do you think there is one?
No. It's not an essentialist argument. It's an argument. It's to say that there is a what sits between. Okay, so this conference is between. Just to lay out the ground, between Wittgenstein and Deleuze is Heidegger, right? So I'm a Heideggerian, if you hadn't noticed. So, and I think that it's useless to try to, for me, it's the classic Heideggerian argument, which is a hammer exists. You want to look at a hammer, right? Figure out, what is this thing? This actually is a hammer, right? So let's instantiate the present at handness to make this into a hammer. So a hammer exists. I can look at this thing and try to figure out why this is a hammer, right? Which Heidegger would say is basically a useless idea. Because actually what you should look at is the fact that it's a hammer because there's a nail. And there's a nail because there's a house. And there's a house because we're human beings. And there's humans, right? So there's an entire being in the world that constitutes the hammerness of this hammer. And in fact, some things are so ontologically close, namely my eyeglasses, that I don't see the glasses, I see the world through the glasses. And only when that present at handness breaks down, so if my glasses stop functioning, I see the glasses, because they're ontically closed, right? But if they're functioning, I see the world, right? Just as a close example. Extrapolate that to a basic phenomenological argument, which is, why do we find this interesting? So it could be this combination of words, or that combination of words. There tends to be some consensus over time about, there is consensus, right? I mean, there is consensus that, certain linguistic constructions are more valuable than others, right?
I think that is
No, there is consensus.
around.
I'm not saying that there's a right one. I'm saying that eventually there's consensus, right? I mean, there are... How many plays were ever written in the history of mankind? There's only one that goes, right? How does it go? Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the sun of York, while now the clouds of Laura upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now our brows bound with victorious reeds, our bristled arms hair for monuments, our stern lot exchanged in many meetings. Right. Grim visage war has smoothed its work of foot, and now, instead of bobbing mounted steeds to fight fierce, faithful adversaries, we came nimbly in its lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I am not shaped for pot of tricks, nor made for court and amorous looking glass. I am that rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before an entering, etc. There's only one play that goes like that. And there's consensus about that being linguistically richer than something else that didn't survive. The other one may be valuable, but it didn't. And there's something about the experience of that which we find interesting. And how would we model that, I think is the way I will pass. How would we model that question?
For you, you bet that at least in certain issues there is a consensus. You make a bet.
I'm simply saying that over time, there tends to be a consensus that certain organizations of language or certain forms are interesting and are continuously interesting. If they weren't, we wouldn't be looking at the same two-dimensional representation on the surface for 500 years. That, or even just abstract the argument and say that itself is interesting. Whether it's a bad one or imagine there is no consensus, culturally speaking, right? Imagine there isn't. Looking at those things, experiencing them is interesting to us, right? Or else they wouldn't exist, we wouldn't do them. We would live in a Deweyan, practical, pragmatic world. We just have things that are functional, right? Which is pretty much a totalitarian nightmare, right? We all wear the same clothes, we all listen to the same music, etc. I know I'm going on and on, but so the question is, how do we model that? That's what's interesting to me. So, is there an algorithmic? Is there something like the German Romantic obsession with interesting? And the way we use it, even linguistically. Well, that's interesting. Like, what is that? How would you model what is interesting? The way it's normally done is through things like class distinctions or sort of cultural norms. We find this color more pleasing than that color. It gets weird when you get to things like, for example, Homer. When you get it gets weird. It gets weird when you get sort of classical Greece, for example.
I agree that there is a consensus of if I see sunset, it's beautiful. But then creating.
I take it one step further and say there is no clear evolutionary reason why we would look at a sunset. I think that's the basic point.
We have two more questions from the audience.
Sorry.
Marianne.
Yeah, I'm not a...
So I completely agree that coalition formation and cooperation through coalition is something that can be addressed, and that has been addressed from using these type of tools, and I think it's really interesting, not specifically to the ending point or the goal that you were saying.
For example, fake news.
Yes, so these coalitions are often leading to a kind of convention, if you wish. So, for instance, this idea of this norm that I showed, I was playing with good and bad reputation. So the definition of good and bad is not predefined, just one bit. So it's kind of the system ends up in a convention that says that 1 is good and 0 is bad, or the opposite. It's something that is self-organized. It's an emergent property. And this can be also used, so for instance, actually a philosopher, Brian Skirms from California, he studies, for instance, the evolution of the social contract, also as a coordination problem. Again, we have this self-organized system that leads us to a kind of a convention, and you can resort to this type of population dynamics to understand the likelihood of a certain coalition or convention and so forth. Did I answer? Yeah.
Please.
Well, just a comment on two goals in terms of the approaches. That is exactly the binary, the ones in versus other, and I see a problem with, but just something else. The relation between the artificial intelligence
So the binary stuff, we use good or bad versus bad. We have. One can also show that this type of models work exactly the same way if you have not, for instance, good and bad, but you have a scaling of scores. So it's not really important. The fact that it's binary makes everything easier if you want to simulate 65,000 norms. Imagine that you have 5 options for each case.
Why binary not 3?
That's an excellent question. I didn't tell you that because the results are different. So we can show that the results are essentially the same. So it's kind of...
It's very irresistible, if I may, to try to throw you against each other.
Yes.
Because let us say that everything you said, Francisco, has a huge direct impact on what philosophers call ethics. Yes. So you said something like every time we design an algorithm, there's an ethical problem, but we can see it the other way around. What you are finding out about cognition has a direct impact on the way that say, ethicists tend to focus on the level of rule, of decision, of ethical choice, game theory. So you are actually subverting. So you actually have nothing to resort to in terms of the ethics tradition, in the sense that the kind of, let's say, empirical modeling that you are engaged with is simply finding out basis of what we for centuries called morality and basically doing lots of shifts. So let's say that you are moving in the territory of ethics, and you, João just said, there's no categorical distinction between what we call art and not art. It's simply not.
I didn't say that.
Not an interesting question.
I didn't say there wasn't no. I didn't say. I did not say there was no categorical distinction.
You said that there's other, much more specific questions that interest you way more than some kind of...
I think we have to... There's a context here, which is that the shifting dialectic between what is considered art and not art is contextual. It's not the same in all eras, and in fact, this is the great Duchampian problem of the 20th century. And all the inversions that implies. It gets complicated, and it's not... I don't know that we have the time or the patience to go through that kind of inversions, but it's contextual depending on what... on what period of time are you talking about? I think
so
what
it's
was
not
being
interesting to
because it was being positioned as a sociological issue, not as that if you could map all the relationships that make something art. And I was pointing at the one thing that would be interesting for me to model, which is the interesting or some affective cognitive phenomenological experience that would draw you towards these things and not others. Now, you could argue that contemplative attention exists in other objects. People have argued that. But to have created a class of objects in the world that has this vibrancy, I guess you could call it, is interesting to me. Could you model that? What do people tend to find? But then when you do it, it gets boring. Because, you find out that people like landscape paintings with fairies or something. And it just doesn't, it isn't interesting, right? Yeah. So you have to push also against that notion. Right, and I think that those categorical distinctions, they may exist. I'm not interested in them. I sort of ignore them as an ontically close, ontologically distant issue. You were going to ask me something else.
No, I was just trying to throw you against each other again.
But we don't want to be thrown against each other.
Francisco
we're cooperating.
He's a scientist and working on AI, but what he's doing is what philosophers throughout the ages called ethics. So, there's no... You are talking about cooperation. You are talking about group cooperation, about morality, about selfishness, about all the topics. Plenty of your sentences sounded like humor, like Cantor. So we can recognize you are doing modeling, computer modeling, but it necessarily has an impact. But what strikes me is that there's a recognizability of something like. Going into the study of, let's call it, our moral behavior, so our moral figuring of situations, our rule following, which whereas I do not have an equally easy way in finding out an aesthetic, what you said, an aesthetic counterpart for that. So it is very clear it's much clearer what the questions can be when you are investigating in what we can call our moral nature, our animal moral nature, And what you just said was extremely interesting, saying that people like pictures with fairies is simply not interesting. So our art is going to be something way more artificial in human behavior in the interesting sense.
Will it be, I guess to put it in different language, could something like what we call art be an emergent phenomenon from, say, AI? And if it were, will it, I mean, this is the Philip K. Dick thing, right? Like, do androids dream of electric sheep? Like, this transposition of a human category. I don't know why I'm being burdened with the aesthetic. I mean, I must have that stink on me from a previous life. But I just think it's a modality of experiencing the world. And it's a modality of experiencing the world which we associate with human behavior. What gets really interesting is when you look at those modalities very closely, you get these funny situations. Like, you all know this hand thing, this handprint on the wall. It's just a primordial gesture. It's a funny, I always think this is a hilarious thing, like, that someone did that. It seems to me like kind of just retarded. And it's a little bit like, people used to identify it as like graffiti, like I was here, like, Joe Neanderthal was here. It's not a Neanderthal handprint, obviously, but and in fact, I always thought of it as the inverse. So to me, and it isn't someone thinking this leaves a very beautiful image. It was about the disappearance of the human in the natural world. So it isn't a negative index of presence. It's a positive index of subsumption. So the way this is made is not, it's a negative space. Which means that whoever made this handprint put their hand on the wall and then blew pigment from their mouth. And for a brief moment of time, the hand and everything around it was one surface.
What do you mean by negative space?
It's negative. It's a negative space.
Oh, negative in the actual space?
Yeah. It's not a red hand. Okay. Right? It's negative space, which means that the hand was red. Right? So we tend to look at it as like this is the sort of origin of representation, and it's not. It's actually the opposite. It's not Dibutatis, the myth of the Greek woman that did the outline of her lover on the wall, and that's the origin of drawing. It's something else. And I guess my question is, will AI arrive at something, an emergent phenomenon similar to this? And the sociology around how that's valued is valid. It doesn't particularly keep me up at night. Yeah.
Please. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for
who's speaking?
I'm just wondering if we are not very well, maybe, because the light flashed. And
because this is an arts festival, that's all.
Oh, yeah, no, I know. Just being provocative. Needlessly so.
About the slashes and about intelligence. We are talking about, we were keep talking about one intelligence from the nature part and the one intelligence for the artificial part. I wonder if, along with the many intelligences that we can find in human and in nature as a whole, like the emotional and the physical and the body intelligence and the intelligences normally address. If you think that are also several intelligences from the artificial part of the equation. This is one question, and the other one is probably more for Francisco, because it's about cooperation, and I'm a biologist, so I was wondering now if, during evolution, we are always being challenged with threats, and that's why evolution takes place. So it's because populations feel threats and feel the consequences of the environmental factors that we evolve, because the ones who cope better with the cold or with the wind or with the runs fast or makes more than the others survive. So during these late challenges like climate change, do you think cooperation is difficult because we are not used to deal with more intangible threats, with more intangible sense perceiving in our flesh the real consequences of cooperating or cheating. Maybe time here is important also to address the cooperating question.
Time is important to address because those who to the show of you coming at 6:30.
Beautiful. Very well done.
Those who want to stay a bit, it's fine, but the people who want to go to see the dance performance will have to leave.
Who is it?
In Ateneo,
okay, right.
at 6:30, there is no dance performance. Just
maybe a short answer?
Yes. Yes, so regarding the first point of the threat, I think it's a very good point, and I agree. Coming back to the previous discussion, it's also interesting to see that many of these issues also can be related with what in biology is called neutral selection, and the idea of the sunrise is the fact that everyone can end up enjoying the sunrise. It doesn't mean that you need to have a fitness advantage because of that, but it's a kind of something that ends up stochastically. Regarding the point of timing, it's really nice. So in 2 weeks ago, we reached to a result. We tried to address these problems of cooperation regarding something that only occurs in the future, and we tried to address experimentally with people playing a game where people had to contribute to avoid the collective disaster that would occur 10 rounds from the beginning. And we addressed the problem of uncertainty on the number of rounds that the end of the world will occur. So imagine we try to address this uncertainty regarding the future. So what we realize is that people start to play risk-averse and start to contribute earlier, but they didn't manage it at the end. The second point is that uncertainty regarding the future has led to polarization. So you have individuals that were contributing more than it would be fair, and you had others that were free-riding all the other. So apparently, the fact that we have the future influences the chances to cooperate, but also leads to polarization, which nowadays, given the political polarization that we face, is also interesting to see how uncertainty plays with our brains in a way. Also, from an evolutionary point of view, can show the same thing, which is cool. Thank you for the question.
Very briefly, João?
It's funny. It sounds like a very good description of religion, the sort of religious mindset. So an intangible future, assessing risk aversion, contributing now for payoff later. I mean, it's basically the metaphysical model of at least Judeo-Christian religiosity, right? It's worried about this intangible other that is judging your reputation for an outcome which you must invest in now, and then there's the split in different factions of whether you invest now or you can just do whatever you want until the end, and then at the end you just say I'm sorry, and then you go to the next level. The other part I want to say is that the question of time is really interesting when it comes to AI. This, I think, is going to be one of the key elements, which is to take what AI can do statically and develop it over time. So the most AI modeling now is very good at dealing with static. Like it can recognize, let's just put it in concrete terms, it can recognize an image. So you can give it an image, and it can analyze that image and predict the content of that image, as it were. It can't do that with a moving image, which is much more difficult. And in fact, we are very good at doing this. We can keep that continuity. And so they'll have to adapt. Like how pigeons go like this. Pigeons go like this because they have to account for parallax when they move. So this is how they reset their visual cortex. Right? And we blink, for example. So there has to be a way in which this tracking motion and tracking identity over motion, right? AI will have to adapt to that. The question of time is really interesting because it's not only in terms of predictive modeling, but it's in terms of what the model is based on and it being dynamic and flexible. Whereas we are quite good. This is at the root of what made us survive. Is you're looking at you see something moving. Oh, all right, probably a threat.
Okay.
Let's end with that. Probably a threat.
Let us end with that. Thank you very much for being here, and in the name of the University of Porto, thank you very much to João for such a splendid idea.